Okay, so this is a mini lecture on Chapter 5, Section 7 and Section 8. I do just want to remind you that you don't need to worry about any of the details on Chapter 5, Section 6 on nails or the one on Chapter 5, Section 5, hair. So hair and nails will not be on your next lecture exam. Okay, moving on to section 7, let's talk a little bit about sweat glands. Sweat glands are also called sudoriferous glands, and we can pretty much find them all over our skin surfaces, with the exception of our nipples and parts of our external genitalia. We have about 3 million of them scattered all over our body, and we have two main types. The first type is eccrine, also called merocrine sweat glands, and the second type is apocrine sweat glands. And they contain myoepithelial cells. These are just specialized cells that can contract upon nervous system stimulation and help force the sweat into ducts and out onto the skin surface. Sweating is controlled by our autonomic nervous system, which we'll talk about later in this course, meaning that we don't have any voluntary control over it. So the first type of sweat gland that we need to cover is the eccrine or the merocrine sweat glands. This is the most numerous type, meaning the majority of our sweat glands are eccrine glands. Where do we find these? All over our palms of our hands, the soles of our feet, and our forehead. And these are the glands that do contain ducts that connect to a pore, and their primary function is in thermoregulation. Thermoregulation is regulated by one division of the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic nervous system. And what do they secrete? They secrete sweat. The bulk of sweat, so 99% of sweat, is water. We do have some salts in there, mostly sodium chloride, as well as some vitamin C, antibodies, dermacidin, which is just a micro-killing protein or a peptide, as well as metabolic waste such as urea and ammonia. Another thing to talk about when we talk about sweat in our skin is that it's also slightly acidic, has a pH around or between 4 and 6. Also, if we're really, really hot, when we start to sweat, our sweating is going to begin in areas around our forehead and then travel inferiorly to the remainder of our body. So that's if we get hot. If we're nervous or anxious, and that's what's inducing our sweating, we're going to begin sweating on our palms and the soles of our feet and our armpits, and then it's going to spread everywhere else on our body. So depending on what is initiating our body to sweat depends where we start sweating. Here's just a picture, so we can see what we're focused on right now is the eccrine gland. And we can see that it is a duct that's releasing into a pore at the surface of the skin. We'll talk a little bit about the sebaceous glands, which are oil glands. The second type of sweat gland that we have is an apocrine gland. And these are typically in areas, our axillary areas, such as our armpits, and our anogenital areas as well. It's the second type of American sweat gland, meaning that they also excrete their substances via excitosis. What do they secrete? The same thing and everything that's in normal sweat that was excreted from eccrine sweat glands, but they also contain some fatty substances and some proteins in it. So it gives them a milky or a yellowish color when we talk about what they're secreting. So typically the secretion, even though it does contain fatty substances such as lipids and proteins, it's initially odorless, but as it breaks down bacteria in your sweat, the breakdown of bacteria is what's going to lead to body odor. So these again are located in areas where you think you would have the most body odor. So again, your axillary or armpit areas. They are slightly larger than eccrine sweat glands, and they're also a little bit deeper in the dermis as well. Some of them do have ducts that empty into hair follicles, but for the most part, they open up into pores on the surface of your skin. And they begin functioning around puberty. They are stimulated by androgens, which are male sex hormones, The exact function of these isn't known, but there are some theories out there regarding uh, pheromones and different other mechanisms for why they may produce this body odor. So, still falling within the apocrine sweat glands, we have two modified versions of these glands. One of these is called ceruminous glands, and these secrete cerumen, and cerumen is just earwax. And then we have mammary glands, which secrete milk. And again, these are modified apocrine glands, not eccrine glands um, that are present in our body. Okay, the other type of gland that is not a sweat gland is a sebaceous or an oil gland, and they're going to secrete sebum, which is just oil. So we have these all over our body, so they're pretty widely distributed, except for in areas of thick skin. So we talked a little bit about thick skin when we talked about the integumentary system. It's going to have the stratum lucidum layer, and we would find thick skin in areas of our palms and the soles of our feet. Most of them develop from hair follicles, some from a pore, and they secrete their substances typically into hair follicles. So when we look at the image down here, we can see that the sebaceous gland is always associated with a hair follicle down here. They're pretty much inactive until we hit puberty. And then once we hit puberty, we're going to stimulate them by the male sex hormones or androgens to become active. And again, they're going to secrete sebum, which is just an oily substance. And they're a holocrine type of secretion, meaning that these glands are going to build up their product until they basically burst. So they build up lipids and cell fragments until they basically burst open, and then they have to rebuild themselves. They also contain, when we talk about sebum, bactericidal properties, which means they have things in there that can help them kill bacteria. And oil or the sebum can also function to help soften hair and also slow the water loss from your skin if we're talking about oils, because lipids will help that. So there's our picture right there. And this is a really good table to go in and study so you can compare the differences between the three types of glands. Again, we have two sweat glands, our eccrine and our apocrine. When we talk about apocrine, we have two modified ones, ceruminous glands and mammary glands that secrete different substances. And then we have our oil glands over here. So you can take a look at their location, where they are. So these secrete things out to the surface of the skin. Apocrine glands, primarily, they can go into a hair follicle here. Sebaceous glands are almost always associated with a hair follicle. And what kind of method they secrete. So exocytosis, basically pushing the substance to the surface or to whatever the pore is opening into, whereas holocrine will build up their products until they burst, and where you can find them. Next, let's talk about the functions of the skin. So the biggest function of the skin is basic barrier from an external environment to our internal environment. And some of these functions, as far as a barrier, include protection, body temperature regulation, cutaneous sensations, metabolic functions, and blood reservoir, as well as excretion of waste. So when we're talking about protection, our skin is basically constantly exposed to microorganisms. We get abrasions, something as small as a paper cut to something more severe. Um, Different weather, so extreme temperatures, something that's really cold to something that's hot, as well as different chemicals and if we're outside a lot, UV radiation. So we have three different barriers. So we have one that protects against chemicals, physical substances, and we have a biological barrier when we're talking about the skin. So the chemical barrier basically constitutes all the chemicals that our skin can secrete, one of which is sweat, which we already talked about, which does contain some antimicrobial proteins. When we talk about our sebaceous glands, those are going to secrete sebum. And we also have defensins, which can also kill bacteria. So basically, these just poke holes into the plasma membrane of bacterial cells, causing them to lyse. And we can also secrete other antimicrobial proteins as well. So chemical barrier includes different types of antimicrobial proteins and defensins that we can find in our sweat and both our sebum. Another chemical barrier is the acid mantle. So our skin has a relatively low pH, so it's slightly acidic, and it's going to help, this acidity is going to help slow bacterial multiplication, so we can get something in there to come in and degrade it before it multiplies out of control. We also have, as you learn from the integumentary system, melanin, which is that tough protein that's going to help protect against UV damage. And so that's also present in our skin. Our second barrier is our physical barrier. And so we have a whole layer of our skin, the most superficial layer, which is keratinized cells of the stratified corneum. This is a thick layer of dead cells, as you probably remember. It's also surrounded by a bunch of glycolipids, which lipids just means glycolipids means that we have a lipid attached to a carbohydrate. That's the glyco part. And these are water resistant. So they help block diffusion of water leaving our body as well as water coming into our body. So we can maintain the amount of water that we need. Some chemicals can penetrate our skin. So some examples here are lipid-soluble substances. Um, Things that are lipid-soluble are oxygen and carbon dioxide, so we want those to be able to penetrate our skin. Also some steroids and some fat-soluble vitamins such as like vitamin D and vitamin K. We also have different plant chemicals such as poison ivy, organic solvents such as acetone and paint thinners. These are going to actually dissolve the lipids that are inside the cell, which is not good. Salts of heavy metals, so lead and mercury, those can also penetrate the skin. Some drugs, and then some drug agents called penetration enhancers. They're placed there on purpose so that drugs can actually go through and cross the layers of our skin. The third barrier when we're talking about protection as a function of our skin are the biological barriers. And this is primarily going to be our cells, so dendritic cells and our macrophages. So our epidermis has a bunch of dendritic cells, if you probably remember, and these can come in and engulf foreign antigens that have somehow gotten into our epidermis, and they're going to present them to our white blood cells that are present in our lymph nodes. And then these white blood cells can activate the immune system. Our dermis, so the layer below our epidermis, contains different type of cell. They contain macrophages. And these macrophages can also activate the immune system by presenting remnants of the broken down viruses and bacteria, or the foreign antigens, to white blood cells and therefore activate the immune system. And the DNA can also absorb harmful UV radiation. However, this is not necessarily a good thing because UV exposure to our DNA can cause mutations, and these mutations can sometimes lead to cancer. So another major function of our skin is thermoregulation, so maintaining our body temperature. So under normal resting body temperature, meaning that our surroundings are cooler than our body itself, our sweat glands produce about 500 milliliters a day of what we call unnoticeable sweat, which we refer to as insensible perspiration, and 500 milliliters is about half a liter. So just at rest, we can't see it. We're perspiring about a half a liter of sweat out per day. However, if our body temperature rises or we're in an environment that's higher than our body temperature, we can produce up to 3 gallons or 12 liters of noticeable sweat. And this sweat that we can actually physically see, we call sensible perspiration. And the whole purpose of this is to keep our body from overheating and to cool our body. If we're placed in a cold environment, so we're outside and say it's like 60 degrees or colder, our dermal blood vessels, our blood vessels that are in our dermis, they're going to constrict or get smaller. And this is going to allow our skin to slow the loss of heat. Okay, another function of our skin is to perceive sensations. So, cutaneous sensory receptors are also part of our nervous system. We have exterior receptors, which respond to stimuli outside of our body, such as temperature and touch. We also have some free nerve endings that sense painful stimuli. So, some examples of the exterior receptors that we talked about previously are like our tactile or Meissner corpuscles, or our lamellar corpuscles. And those are going to sense deep pressure. We also have some hair follicle receptors, and we also, just like I said, we have some plain free nerve endings that can sense painful stimuli. Another function of the skin is that it does have some metabolic functions. So our skin can synthesize vitamin D, or actually a vitamin D precursor, which is needed to produce vitamin D. And we need vitamin D in order to absorb calcium in our intestines. So it's actually crucial. It doesn't matter how much calcium we have as an intake. If we don't have vitamin D there, we can't actually absorb it, and we're just going to excrete it out. Um, Other things that it can do is the chemicals from our keratinocytes, they can go in and disarm some carcinogens. They can also activate some hormones. So, for example, they can convert cortisone into hydrocortisone. And we also have an enzyme called collagenase, which can aid in the natural turnover to prevent wrinkles. So, anytime you see A's, that means that it's an enzyme. So, these are different metabolic functions that it has. You don't really need to understand the specific ones other than maybe synthesizing a vitamin D precursor, but focus on the fact that our skin does have metabolic functions. Another function is a blood reservoir. So, about 5% of our total blood volume in our body is held in our skin, and specifically in our dermis, because our epidermis does not have any blood supply at all. And we can use the blood supply, so the vessels that are in our dermis, and we can constrict them when we need to, so we can shunt blood to other organs. So if we're exercising and we need to get our blood to our muscles and to our heart, we can constrict our blood vessels so that we can move the blood flow to the areas that we need it during that time. Okay, I think the final function of skin that we need to cover is excretion. So our skin can secrete a bunch of metabolic waste, some things called nitrogenous wastes, such as ammonia, urea, and uric acid. Even though it does function in being able to excrete some of these wastes, most of it is excreted in the urine. And if we're sweating a lot, we can also lose a lot of water and salt in our sweat, so that would need to be replenished. And that's it for this section.